On a Harlem corner, 12 hard-eyed men close in on Bumpy Johnson like a noose someone's laughing, daring him to bleed. The street expects shouting. It gets Bumpy silence instead. Harlem had a way of holding its breath without anybody admitting it. That afternoon the air sat low and warm, thick with fried oil from the corner stand and the tired perfume of summer heat trapped in brick. Men leaned in doorways like they were nailed there. Women moved with their shopping bags close to their hips. Kids cut between stoops and hydrants, quick as cats, but even they kept one eye on the corner, because Bumpy Johnson was coming down the block. He didn't hurry. He never did. A man who runs tells the street he's being chased. Bumpy walked as if the sidewalk was something he'd paid for and forgot to mention. Hat set straight, coat hanging easy, hands visible. Not apologizing for the space his body took up. 2 stores down, an old man sweeping his own steps paused mid-stroke and watched with the solemn attention of church. A woman at the window pulled her curtain back only a finger's width, just enough. Across the way, a young runner with a folded paper under his belt slowed and then stopped, like the solace of his shoes had suddenly remembered respect. Bumpy gave none of them a nod, not because he didn't see them, because he didn't need to prove he did. He reached the corner where Lenox met the cross street, where traffic crawled and conversations traveled. The light changed. A cab honked once, then thought better of it, and that was when the circle began to close. 12 men. Not boys. Men with shoulders trained by hard work and harder habits. They weren't dressed alike, but they moved alike. The same thought had climbed into 12 bodies at once. One stepped from beside the newsstand. 2 slid off a stoop. Another drifted from the barbershop doorway, still chewing on a toothpick like he had all the time in the world. They formed around Bumpy the way a river forms around a stone. Quiet, inevitable, hungry to show its strength. Bumpy stopped, not startled, not angry, just stopped. His gaze moved once, slow, measuring. He counted them without counting. A man like him didn't need numbers, he needed shape. He saw the angles, the exits, the distance to the curb. The way one of them kept his right hand too close to his coat pocket, like a secret itching to be used. The street made a decision and went silent. It was not fear. Harlem had seen fear. This was something older expectation. The expectation that blood, once invited, must be entertained. That a public insult demanded a public response. That if Bumpy Johnson was surrounded, somebody was about to get taught a lesson. One of the 12 stepped forward, just a half pace. He wore his confidence like cheap cologne strong and meant to be noticed. "Look at him," the man said loud. "Enough to carry." Walking like the Lord put his name on the bricks. A few quiet laughs rose from the circle, small and sharp. A blade of sound meant to cut. Bumpy's eyes stayed on the speaker. He didn't blink, didn't tighten his jaw. His face was still as a carved thing. The man leaned closer, invading the inch of air that belonged to another man's dignity. "You ain't got your boys with you today," he said. "You lose 'em? Or you finally learn to walk alone?" That was the insult, not the words. Harlem was full of words. The insult was the place. Daylight. Public. Right there where women could hear it and children could repeat it. And store owners could decide what kind of protection they were paying for. It wasn't just aimed at Bumpy. It was aimed at the neighborhood's faith in him. Bumpy let the insult hang. Let it cool. Let it show itself for what it was, a desperate hand reaching for a crown it couldn't carry. Across the street, a man stood with his back against a lamppost, half in shade, half in sun. He was smaller than most of the bodies on that corner. Wiry, with calm eyes that didn't flinch at the shape of trouble. His hair was neat, his face young, but there was something disciplined in him, something trained. He had been watching before the circle formed. He didn't look like Harlem. Not born of it, not raised on its rules. He looked like he belonged to a different kind of fight, one measured in breath and balance. Not bravado, Bruce Lee. He wasn't famous on that corner. Not yet in the way legends become public property. But the man had the posture of someone who paid attention to what others missed. His gaze wasn't on the mouths. It was on the feet. The weight shifts. The readiness. He watched 12 men surround Bumpy Johnson, and he didn't see a simple ambush. He saw a question being asked. Would Bumpy answer with violence, or would he answer with authority? The leader of the 12 lifted his chin, savoring the silence like it was weakness. "You hear me, Bumpy?" he said. "I'm talking to you." One of the 12 spat to the side, as if the ground needed to be disrespected to another man taller, with a scar that pulled a corner of his mouth, snickered and added, "Maybe he can't talk without permission." That line got a louder laugh. That was the point. Not to hurt him, to make him perform. To make Harlem watch him become ordinary. Bumpy's shoulders didn't rise. His hands didn't curl. He did not reach for a gun. He did not step back. He did not speak out. The quiet felt wrong to the 12. Quiet has a way of making reckless men feel exposed. It gives them too much room to hear their own cowardice. So the leader filled the space again, stepping closer, chest out, breath hot with arrogance. "You ain't no king," he said. "Just an old man wearing a hat." Harlem held its breath tighter. A child on a stoop stopped bouncing his ball. The ball rolled a foot and rested, like even it didn't want to make noise. Bruce Lee's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in calculation. He watched Bumpy's face, looking for the tiny tremor that comes before violence, the twitch, the flare, the shift of weight. But Bumpy stood like a man rooted. He stared at the leader with the calm of someone who had already buried men who talked like this. The calm of someone who did not need to prove it. And then, finally, Bumpy spoke. Not loud. Not for the crowd. For the man directly in front of him. His voice came out smooth, low, carrying no hurry. "You brought 12. Bumpy said. That was all. No curse. No threat. No speech. Just a sentence that made the corner colder. The leader frowned, as if he hadn't understood. "So what?" Bumpy's gaze moved past him, over the man's shoulder, taking in the others like they were furniture. Then back. "You brought 12. He repeated, and there was something in the repetition that pressed on the throat. "That means you ain't sure." The laughter died like a candle pinched between fingers. A couple of the 12 shifted. Not much. But enough. Bumpy hadn't insulted their strength. He'd exposed their doubt. The leader's face tightened. Pride flared. His hand twitched toward his pocket, toward whatever made him feel brave, and that was when the street's expectation sharpened into a blade. Because now there was a moment where one wrong move could open Harlem like a wound. Bruce Lee leaned the slightest inch forward, not stepping in, not interfering, just ready. As if respect demanded attention even from a stranger. Bumpy's hands remained open. His eyes did not, and the circle, already closed, began to feel the weight of 30 seconds it did not yet understand. The corner did not explode. Not yet. The 12 men stayed where they were, caught between hunger and caution, and Harlem leaned closer without moving. In that kind of silence, the past comes forward. Old debts, old lessons, old funerals. Bumpy Johnson stood inside that ring like a man, standing in his own parlor. The trick was not courage. Courage was cheap. Any fool could be brave for a minute. The trick was ownership of himself, of the moment, of the neighborhood's breath. Harlem had given him that, and Harlem demanded he keep it. A block away, Miss Pearl's grocery had its door propped open with a milk crate. The bell above it refused to ring because nobody was going in or out. Miss Pearl watched from behind stacked oranges, eyes sharp as pins. She had known Bumpy back when his suit didn't fit right, back when men tried him just to see if the stories were true. She remembered how he handled the loud ones. He never gave them what they wanted. He gave them what they deserved. Across the avenue, the barber with the white apron stopped mid-sweep, broom angled like a weapon he'd forgotten how to use. He had once been short on rent, not because he was lazy, but because the winter had been cruel and customers had been thin. The man who helped him wasn't the church, wasn't the city, wasn't the politicians smiling in their clean coats. It was Bumpy. No parade, no handshake. Just an envelope slid across the counter and a quiet sentence. Keep your shop open. Man. Need dignity. That was how Bumpy ruled Harlem, by keeping the lights on. People outside the neighborhood thought power meant noise. Guns, sirens, bodies laid out as warnings. Harlem knew better. Harlem knew power was who could settle a dispute without waking the babies. Who could stop a boy from picking up a knife by giving him a job carrying boxes? Who could keep a landlord from throwing a widow onto the curb by making one phone call that didn't sound like a request? Bumpy did those things, and he did them without asking to be loved. That was why he was feared in a different way. The circle around him wasn't just 12 men. It was the question of whether that kind of authority still mattered to young blood. The city kept changing. The streets learned new sins. And every few years somebody decided the old rules were old because they were weak. They were always wrong. Bumpy's name traveled through Harlem like a hymn and like a warning. In back rooms it was spoken with gratitude. In alleys it was spoken with caution. In the mouths of children it was spoken with a kind of awe, the way kids talk about storms. They've never stood in. He had built that name with restraint. He could have turned the third in the neighborhood into a graveyard and called it order. He didn't. He understood that fear alone is brittle. Fear cracks when the first brave fool decides he'd rather die loud than live quiet. So Bumpy made loyalty heavier than fear. He paid for funerals, not because it looked noble, but because no mother should have to beg for a box to put her boy in. He paid school fees for kids who weren't his, because a child who can read a contract is harder to cheat. He kept his word with shop owners, because a man who eats from the same place every week is tied to that place by more than appetite. And when he punished, he did it like an adult. No spectacle, no cruelty for sport. He punished the way winter punishes, clean, inevitable, and without apology. Bruce Lee watched all of this without being told. He could not read every Harlem detail, but he could read structure. He could see that the crowd did not treat Bumpy like a mere tough. They treated him like a fixed point, like the corner itself. The bodies around the ring weren't only threatening Bumpy. They were threatening the invisible order that kept the block from falling into chaos. Bruce's gaze went to the bystanders' hands. They weren't reaching for weapons. They were reaching for patience. That was the difference. A neighborhood that believes in a man doesn't rush to save him. It waits to see how he saves them. Bumpy's eyes remained steady. He did not posture. He did not plead. A thin boy near the hydrant stared at him with wide, hungry eyes. The boy had once run messages for men who promised him coins and gave him bruises instead. Bumpy had pulled him aside one day and said nothing for a long time, letting the boy squirm in the quiet. Then Bumpy had handed him a small sack of groceries and pointed toward his mother's building. "Take that home," he'd said. "And don't carry poison for men who wouldn't carry water for you." That boy never forgot. Now the boy watched the ring of 12 and felt the old fear trying to climb his spine. He also felt something else, certainty. Not that Bumpy couldn't be hurt. Anyone could be hurt. But that Bumpy would not be owned, not by 12 men. Not by a crowd's appetite for violence. The police knew it too. Patrolmen who pretended they ran the avenue measured their mornings by whether Bumpy was calm. When he wanted trouble, Trouble arrived wearing a badge or a rival's grin. When he won at peace, even the corners softened. He didn't do it with speeches. He did it with presence, showing up at a hospital, a basement, a landlord's office making. Men understand Harlem was not an orphan to be bullied. Inside the circle, the leader tried to recover his laughter. He shifted his feet, testing for weakness, and found none. Bumpy stood like a judge who had already seen the verdict. Harlem remembered what belonged to it, and the 12 men, whether they knew it or not, were standing on ground that had rules. Older than their courage, the 12 hadn't come for money. Money had rules. You could argue money. You could negotiate it, stall it, repay it with interest or apology. Money was business. This was theater. Bumpy Johnson knew it the moment the circle tightened without, hands reaching for his pockets. No one asked about numbers. No one mentioned shipments or percentages. They came empty of ledgers and full of witnesses. They came to stain him. Public disrespect was a currency more dangerous than cash. If a man like Bumpy could be surrounded in daylight, pressed, mocked, handled, then every small-time rival in Harlem would feel his courage grow overnight. Protection would weaken. Storekeepers would hesitate. Young soldiers would test orders. Instead of following them, authority didn't collapse from bullets first, it collapsed from doubt. The leader of the 12 understood that much, even if he didn't understand the full cost of what he was trying to buy. His name didn't matter to history, but on that street he was called Carter, a man built wide, with ambition that had outgrown his patience. He had muscle behind him, new alliances, whispers of backing from men outside Harlem who thought the old neighborhood could be broken like dry wood. Carter didn't want Bumpy's money. He wanted Bumpy's shadow. He stepped closer again, filling the space that Bumpy refused to surrender. "You know why we here," Carter said, voice low but sharpened for the crowd. "Times change, streets change, old names fade." Bumpy listened without expression. Carter gestured slightly with his chin, indicating the ring. "We represent the new arithmetic. You still count like yesterday matters." A couple of the 12 nodded, feeding off the sound of their own agreement. Bruce Lee watched their feet again. He saw restlessness, not unity restlessness. These men were brave in a group, but they weren't breathing as one. Some leaned forward too much. Others hung half a step back, as if ready to disappear if thunder struck. Bruce had trained long enough to know the difference between a disciplined unit and a collection of egos. Borrowing courage from proximity. 12 bodies, one fragile message. Bumpy's eyes moved slowly around the ring, acknowledging each face without greeting it. He was reading loyalty the way a banker reads signatures. Some of them he recognized not by name, but by story. Young men who used to stand straighter when he walked past, men who'd once benefited from the quiet order he built. Now they were here, standing against it, trying on rebellion like a new suit that didn't quite fit. That hurt Harlem more than it hurt him. Carter mistook Bumpy's silence for hesitation. "You had your era," Carter continued. "You kept things tight. Kept things respectable." He smirked at the word like it tasted bitter. "But respect don't run these blocks anymore. Power does." Bumpy finally spoke, voice calm enough to make the sentence feel like law instead of opinion. "Respect is power," he said. "No anger, no volume. Just correction." Carter chuckled, but it came out thin. "That's the kind of thinking that gets old men embarrassed." He stepped even closer, now close enough that their coats almost touched. The move was deliberate. Proximity is dominance when fear is present, but fear wasn't present. Bumpy didn't move back, didn't stiffen. He simply allowed Carter to stand there, like a child standing too close to a furnace he didn't understand. The other 11 shifted, tightening instinctively. The pressure in the air thickened. Harlem's witnesses leaned forward without meaning. 2. Bruce Lee watched Carter's right hand again, that twitch toward the pocket. He knew that twitch. It belonged to men who wanted violence not because it was necessary, but because they needed it to validate their courage. He also watched. Bumpy's breathing slow even unmoved. This wasn't a man calculating survival. This was a man calculating consequences. Carter spoke again, louder now, wanting the crowd to carry his words further down the avenue. You ain't untouchable, Bumpy. We wanted you to know that. Wanted Harlem to know it too. There it was. The true purpose laid bare. Not robbery. Reputation surgery. Bumpy's gaze lifted past Carter to the men behind him. He spoke not just to the leader, but to the borrowed courage surrounding him. You bring 12 men, Bumpy said quietly, to tell one man he can be touched. No mockery in the tone, just arithmetic. A ripple moved through the ring tiny, but real. Carter felt it and tried to crush it fast. Don't twist this, he snapped. We brought 12 because that's what it takes now. Bumpy nodded once, as if acknowledging a confession. That's what it takes for you. The sentence landed heavier than any shove could have, because it separated Carter from the myth he was trying to build. It reframed the circle not as strength, but as dependence. One of the 12 glanced sideways at another, discomfort flickering like heat lightning. Bruce Lee noticed that immediately. He had seen fights won before the first strike simply because unity cracked. The moment a group begins to question itself, the outcome tilts, even if no punch is thrown. Carter's jaw tightened. He stepped even closer, invading breath itself now. You think silence saves you? He asked. You think stand-in still makes you bigger? Bumpy's reply came softer than before. I don't stand still, he said. I stand firm. Harlem felt that line settle deep, because firmness wasn't about muscle. It was about principle. Carter's patience thinned. He had expected shouting. Threats, maybe a drawn weapon he could answer with his own. He had prepared for chaos. He had not prepared for composure. So he reached for escalation. His hand finally came out of the pocket, not holding a gun, but pressing a single finger against Bumpy's chest. A chest, a tiung chua tinjing churchin chumpampan hens, a kavanjun tren na Bumpy's chest. Push without force. An insult without bruising, but public. Very public. The street gasped, not aloud, but inward. That gesture crossed from challenge into handling. It said, you can be touched. You can be moved. Bruce Lee's body tensed slightly, not to intervene, but because the moment had sharpened into a blade's edge. He watched Bumpy's eyes closely, not the body. The eyes, because the eyes betray the coming storm. But Bumpy did not. Flare. He did not slap the hand away. He did not even look down at the finger on his chest. He looked straight into Carter's face and let the silence stretch so long it became uncomfortable to breathe inside it. Then Bumpy spoke, barely louder. Then a murmur, but the kind that carries because the world wants to hear it. You put your hand on me, he said, like you ready for what comes after. Carter smirked, but the smirk had effort in it now. Maybe I am. Bumpy's gaze did not move. No, he said. You are ready for the show. You ain't ready for the aftermath. That word, aftermath, hung heavier than threat, because violence is loud, aftermath is permanent. Somewhere behind Carter, one of the 12 swallowed hard. Bruce Lee saw it. He understood then that the circle was no longer tightening. It was holding beneath 12 men simply by refusing to perform for them. And the message Carter brought, the message meant to weaken. Bumpy was starting to turn fragile in his own grip, because power, real power, doesn't rush to prove itself. It lets impatience expose weakness. The street could feel it now. The fight everyone expected. Optional. And that made the 12 far more uneasy than violence ever could. The finger stayed on Bumpy's chest a moment too long, not pressing hard, just enough to exist. Enough to let the witnesses measure the insult. He wanted Harlem to remember this angle, this distance, this posture. Didn't brush it off. Didn't even acknowledge it physically. Like a man listening to rain against a window he owned. The longer the hand stayed there, the more the moment began. To sour not for Bumpy, but for Carter. Because touching a man like Bumpy without consequence required certainty, and certainty was leaking. Bruce Lee watched Carter's wrist carefully. The body recognizing it had stepped somewhere irreversible. Bruce had spent years studying control, not just of fists, but of escalation. But with pride cornered by silence, and Carter's pride was now cornered. "You ain't saying nothin'," Carter muttered, louder than before, trying to pull the crowd back onto his side. "Maybe you ain't got nothin' left to say." One of the 12 chuckled on cue, but it came late. Forced. Bumpy finally let his eyes drop not to the hand itself, but just beneath Carter's collar, as if inspecting the weight of the man. Pressing against him. When he spoke, it was slow enough to feel deliberate. "You finished? You want me to be?" Bumpy's eyes returned to his. "I want you to understand the difference between noise and consequence." A breeze moved down the avenue, carrying paper trash along the curb like it didn't want to linger near what was forming. Carter's jaw flexed. He pushed slightly harder with the finger, now not enough to move Bumpy, but enough to signal stubbornness. Bruce Lee shifted his stance a fraction. Weight redistributing, ready not to strike, but to react. If chaos broke. His respect for Bumpy had already formed without introduction. Voice dropping to a near whisper meant only for Bumpy. "You think these people still yours?" he murmured. "You think they bleed for you the way they used to?" Bumpy's reply came instantly. "They don't bleed for me," he said. "They live because I don't let them." That line didn't rise above conversation level, but it spread anyway. He shielded it. Carter pulled his hand back at last, but not out of respect. Out of irritation. The gesture had failed to trigger the eruption he needed. So he escalated again. He turned slightly, raising his voice for the crowd. "Y'all see this?" he called. "Man been running Harlem 30 years. Defend his own chest." A couple of younger bystanders shifted uncomfortably. Not because they believed Carter, but because public disrespect demanded some response. Further, "Maybe it's time somebody younger wore the crown," he said, spreading his arms slightly as if inviting agreement. "Somebody who ain't afraid to get his hands dirty in public." The insult wasn't subtle now. It was theatrical. He wanted Bumpy to either fight or shrink. Bumpy did neither. He adjusted his hat slightly, a small, precise movement that had nothing to do with Carter and everything to do with dignity. The gesture said, "They say, I have time." "You don't single quotes T. Carter felt it even if he couldn't articulate it. His voice rose again, sharper now. "What you got to say, old man?" Bumpy looked at him for a long moment, not angry, not dismissive. Studying him the way a judge studies a defendant before sentencing. Then he spoke quietly. "You mistake calm for weakness," Carter scoffed. "Do I?" "Is what keeps me from ending conversations early." The street went still again, not because of the threat, but because of the restraint wrapped inside it. He hadn't said he would hurt Carter. He'd said he was choosing not to. That distinction mattered in Harlem. It reframed power from reaction to permission. Carter laughed loudly, trying to shake off the chill creeping into the ring. "You talk like you still untouchable." Bumpy's eyes didn't leave his. "No," he said. Silence. Again, longer this time. One of the 12 shifted backward half a step. Without realizing it, another adjusted his coat like the temperature had dropped. Bruce Lee felt the momentum turning not violently, but psychologically. Becomes reckless. So he did the one thing left that could still spark the explosion he came for. He stepped forward and shoved. Bumpy, not a punch, not even a full force, pushed just enough to rock the balance. Gasps rippled through the witnesses like wind through. Leaves. Bruce Lee's muscles tightened instantly. Ready for the break, but Bumpy did something unexpected. He didn't shove back. He didn't step forward. He didn't even harden. He let the movement happen, absorbed it, feet adjusting subtly, body settling back into stillness like a tree swaying, and returning upright. And then he looked at Carter with something colder than anger. Disappointment? You done? Bumpy asked again. But this time the question carried weight, because, and still got nothing he could use. No spectacle. No loss of composure. No collapse of authority. Only exposure. The ring felt thinner now, less like 12 men surrounding one, and more like 12 men standing too close to something they didn't fully understand. Bruce Lee exhaled slowly, recognizing the rarest kind of dominance, the kind that wins without striking. But the moment wasn't finished. Not yet, because pride, once ignited in public, doesn't retreat easily, and the next 30 seconds would decide whether Carter's theater ended in blood or in something far more devastating to his reputation. Time does not always move forward. Sometimes it narrows. On that corner in Harlem, the witnesses felt it. The 12 felt it. Even the bricks seemed to lean inward. Feet firm, shoulders relaxed, head undisturbed. Remain precise. A swing, a reach, a signal to hidden men. Patient. Bumpy's eyes held Carter's without heat, not angry, not threatened, just certain. The kind of certainty that makes loud men feel like children shouting into a well. Bruce Lee watched Carter's breathing change. It was the edge where mistakes were born. The 12 shifted again. Their formation was no longer tight. It was uncertain. Wondering how this would be remembered, Bumpy spoke. Soft. Steady. You done? He asked once more. The same words, but now they sounded just recognition. It was over, he said, when you needed an audience. That sentence struck harder than any fist. Because it revealed the truth. Bumpy. He was here to be seen defeating him. Power that requires witnesses is already insecure. The street. Not celebration. Recognition. Carter sensed the shift and tried to reclaim it. He stepped forward again, but this time there was hesitation in it. The momentum had changed direction, and he was walking against it. You ain't untouchable. Bumpy took one single step forward. Not aggressive, not fast, just enough to close the space Carter had tried to own. The movement was small, but it was decisive. Now it was Carter who had to decide whether to retreat or collide. Bruce Lee saw it clearly. The geometry had reversed. Bumpy was no longer inside the circle. The circle was inside his stillness. Bumpy's voice lowered even further, meant only for Carter but heard by the silence. You brought 12 men, he said. You shoved me in daylight. You raised your voice. He paused. And I am still standing exactly where I choose to stand. The words were not loud. They were heavy. Carter's jaw tightened. He looked briefly over his shoulder at the 11 behind him, seeking reinforcement. What he found was doubt. Not betrayal, but doubt. One man avoided his gaze. Another shifted his weight backward. A third subtly widened the space between himself and Carter, as if proximity might soon cost something. Bumpy didn't raise his hands. He didn't threaten. He simply let the consequences breathe. You want Harlem? Bumpy continued quietly. You take care of Harlem. His eyes moved deliberately to the storefronts, the stoops, the watching windows. You pay for funerals, he said. You keep lights on. You make sure mothers sleep without listening for footsteps. He returned his gaze to Carter. Then you come stand in front of me. The challenge wasn't about violence. It was about responsibility. Carter had no answer for that. He had muscle. He had noise. He had ambition. But he did not have history. The 30 seconds were ending, not in gunfire, not in fists, but in clarity. Bumpy stepped 1 inch closer, so close now that Carter could feel the steadiness in his breathing. If you want to test me, Bumpy said softly, you do it without a crowd. Without a performance, he let that sit. Otherwise, you just rehearsing. The word cut deep. Rehearsing. Not leading, not conquering. Rehearsing. Carter's shoulders stiffened. Pride flared one last time in his eyes, but it found no fuel in the faces around him. Because the crowd had already chosen. Not through cheers, not through applause, through stillness. They were not looking at Carter anymore. They were looking at Bumpy, and that was the final blow. Carter stepped back. Just one step, small enough to pretend it meant nothing. Large enough that everyone saw it. The 11 behind him felt it instantly. The formation loosened, then fractured. One by one, not dramatically, not with apology, they widened the circle. Space opened around Bumpy, not because he forced it, because they gave it. Bruce Lee watched with quiet respect. He had seen men win fights with fists. He had seen men win them with speed. He had rarely seen a man win one with stillness. Carter swallowed hard, scanning the faces around him as if searching for the momentum he'd lost. He found none. So he did the only thing left that preserved some dignity. He nodded once, tight and controlled, as if this had been a conversation all along. We'll talk again, he muttered. Bumpy gave a slight incline of his head. Not agreement, not dismissal. Maybe, he said. The word held no fear. The 12 turned, not in panic, not running, but walking away with the fragile posture of men who understood they had miscalculated. The street exhaled. Sound returned slowly. Traffic, distant laughter, the bounce of the boys' ball finally resumed. Bumpy adjusted his coat once, as if brushing off dust that had never truly settled. Bruce Lee remained where he was, studying the man who had just parted 12 without striking one. Their eyes met briefly across the avenue. No words. Just acknowledgement. Respect recognizes itself without introduction. Bumpy turned and continued down the sidewalk as if nothing had happened. But Harlem knew 30 seconds had passed, and 12 men had learned that power does not shout. It stands. The street did not erupt after the 12 left. It settled. Harlem had seen gunfire celebrations before, men firing pride into the sky as if noise could stamp victory into memory. This was different. This victory did not belong to spectacle. It belonged to discipline. Bumpy Johnson kept walking. Same pace. Same posture. No backward glance, because turning around would make the moment about them. And at WSN single quotes T. It was about Harlem. The boy with the ball watched him pass, eyes wide with the kind of understanding that only forms when fear is dissolved without blood. The ball bounced once, twice, then stopped as the boy spoke quietly to no one in particular. He didn't even fight. An older man beside him replied without looking away from Bumpy's retreating figure. He did, the man said. You just ain't used to that kind. That was the lesson Harlem absorbed in the quiet that followed. Power did not always break bones. Sometimes it prevented them from breaking at all. Inside Miss Pearl's grocery, the bell finally rang as someone stepped in. Conversation resumed, but softer, reverent, like people leaving church. The barber across the avenue shook his head slowly, half smiling, as if he had just watched a familiar sermon, delivered without words, because what Bumpy had protected was not his pride. It was order. 12 men had tried to drag him into chaos, the kind that makes headlines and funerals and widows. Rival opportunists. Streets tightening under suspicion. Bumpy understood that cost before Carter ever formed the circle. He knew the difference between winning a moment and safeguarding a future. That was why restraint, for him. Engine low, driver watching through the rearview mirror. Not police, not rivals. Just one of the quiet guardians Bumpy kept nearby, not to fight his battles, but to manage the ripples afterward, because aftermath was where real leadership lived. By sundown, word would travel not as rumor, but as testimony. Left. No blood spilled. And that story would carry weight heavier than violence ever could. Rivals would hear it and understand the message Carter had accidentally delivered. Bumpy Johnson did not need theatrics to maintain control. His authority did not depend on reaction. It depended on inevitability. Bruce. The breath control, the psychological reversals. Equivalent. Bumpy hadn't neutralized 12 men physically, he had neutralized their purpose. Bruce watched Bumpy disappear into the rhythm of Harlem, greeted by nods, subtle gestures, quiet acknowledgments that never looked like submission. Only respect freely given that fascinated him. Respect that is demanded breeds rebellion. Respect that is earned breeds loyalty. Carter, meanwhile, Carter didn't answer immediately because he knew the truth none of them wanted to say aloud. They had pressed him, and nothing had moved. Another man spoke, voice low. He ain't like other old heads. He ain't. That was the price of the encounter. Not bruises. Perspective. Carter had wanted to weaken Bumpy publicly. Instead, he had reinforced him because every witness had seen the same thing. A man surrounded by 12 who never once surrendered ownership of the moment. Back on Lenox, dusk began its slow descent. Store lights flickered on. Music crept from open windows. Life resumed, not because danger had vanished, but because order had been reaffirmed. Bumpy paused briefly outside a brownstone, speaking quietly to a mother about her son's job prospects. No mention of the circle. No hint that his day had contained confrontation. That too was leadership, shielding the community not only from violence, but from the anxiety of knowing how close it came. He tipped his hat once before moving on, and Harlem, in its collective memory, placed another stone into the foundation of his legacy, not a story of fists or gunfire, but of 30 seconds where 12 men parted because one man refused to become smaller than the responsibility he carried.